To understand why Iran has stood defiantly against two global powers, the USA and Israel, we need to dive deep into a story woven with history, revolution, and survival. Iran's hatred isn't born overnight. It's a centuries-old struggle rooted in politics, power, and the protection of identity. Iran, once known as Persia, was a cradle of civilization, an empire of great strength and influence. But like many powerful nations, its riches and resources soon attracted the hungry eyes of global superpowers. By the early 20th century, both Britain and Russia had their hands on Iran, controlling its vital oil resources. The Iranian people watched as foreign powers bled their nation dry. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, today known as British Petroleum (BP), symbolized this exploitation. Iran's oil, its lifeblood, was being extracted and sold by outsiders, leaving the Iranian people with nothing but poverty and resentment. And then came the United States. At first, Iran and the US shared friendly relations. American support flowed into the Shah's government, modernizing the nation, but at a steep cost. The Shah's regime, supported by the US, became notorious for corruption, political oppression, and a widening gap between the rich and poor. For the Iranian people, this era symbolized betrayal. Their resources were in the hands of foreigners, and their government, propped up by American power, grew increasingly distant from the struggles of ordinary Iranians. But this discontent would eventually erupt. A figure emerged, vowing to reclaim Iran's identity and throw off the chains of foreign influence, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. His message resonated with the masses. Iran should be for Iranians, free from Western interference. What followed was a revolution that would forever change the fate of Iran, the Middle East, and the world. But before we understand how this revolution turned Iran into a bitter adversary of the USA and Israel, we need to look at the deeper divisions that were already brewing beneath the surface. Before the rise of the Islamic Revolution, there was an even older divide shaping the conflicts in the region: the religious split between Shia and Sunni Muslims. And to understand Iran's stance today, we must go back to the 7th century, to the time after Prophet Muhammad's death. The Muslim community divided over who should succeed the Prophet. One group supported his close companion Abu Bakr, while another favored his son-in-law Ali. This disagreement led to the birth of two sects, Sunni and Shia Muslims. The Sunnis followed Abu Bakr, and the Shia, who were the minority, followed Ali. This religious divide has endured for centuries, but it wasn't just about faith, it became about power. Today, Sunni Muslims make up the vast majority of the Muslim world, with Saudi Arabia as the leading Sunni power. Iran, however, is the heartland of Shia Islam. Iran's position as a Shia majority country surrounded by Sunni majority neighbors has led to ongoing tensions, particularly with Saudi Arabia, the de facto leader of the Sunni world. But this divide wasn't just theological, it influenced politics, alliances, and global power plays. The Shia-Sunni split became a proxy battlefield for Iran and Saudi Arabia to extend their influence across the region. From Lebanon to Syria, Iraq to Yemen, the two powers have clashed repeatedly. Iran backs Shia militant groups like Hezbollah, while Saudi Arabia supports Sunni governments and factions. This proxy war has defined Middle Eastern politics for decades. But in this struggle for dominance, something changed in 1979 that tipped the balance of power forever in Iran's favor: the Islamic Revolution. And from this revolution, Iran's hatred for the US and Israel grew even stronger. By the 1970s, Iran had become a battlefield of ideologies. On one side was the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, backed by the United States. On the other, the rising discontent of the Iranian people, fed up with poverty, corruption, and foreign control. The Shah's regime had become synonymous with brutality and repression, and who was standing behind him? The United States. For decades, the US had supported the Shah, funneling money, weapons, and influence into his government. The US viewed Iran as a key ally in the region, a bulwark against Soviet influence and a crucial source of oil. But in the eyes of the Iranian people, the Shah was nothing more than a puppet of Western powers, enriching himself while the nation suffered. While the Shah lived in luxury, the rest of Iran struggled with rising unemployment, food shortages, and a widening gap between rich and poor. This inequality ignited a firestorm of protests across the country, led by a man who had spent years in exile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini's message was simple but powerful: reject the West, overthrow the Shah, and establish an Islamic state ruled by the principles of Sharia law. His speeches, smuggled into Iran through cassette tapes, sparked a revolution, and soon the streets of Tehran were flooded with protesters demanding change. In January 1979, the pressure became too much for the Shah to handle. Facing massive protests, strikes, and a crumbling economy, he fled Iran, seeking refuge in the United States. For the Iranian people, his departure marked the end of an era, one dominated by foreign interference, exploitation, and dictatorship. On February 1, 1979, Khomeini returned to Iran as a hero. His arrival was met with millions of supporters, signaling the birth of a new era, one where Iran would no longer bow to Western powers. Within months, the Islamic Republic of Iran was born, led by Khomeini as the supreme leader. But the revolution didn't just topple the Shah, it also severed Iran's ties with the United States. The revolution had not only uprooted the Shah's regime, but also turned the US into Iran's #1 enemy. And as we'll see next, the hatred between Iran and America would soon take a dramatic and dangerous turn. The US Embassy hostage crisis, a breaking point. By the fall of 1979, Iran's relationship with the United States was on the verge of collapse. The Shah, now in the US for cancer treatment, represented everything the new Islamic Republic despised: foreign interference, corruption, and betrayal. But the hatred for the US had now become something more: a demand for justice. On November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats hostage. Their demand was clear: the US must return the Shah to Iran to face trial for his crimes. But for the students and many Iranians, this was more than just about one man. It was a statement, an act of defiance against American imperialism. For 444 days, these hostages would remain in captivity, as the world watched the situation unfold. The United States, once Iran's strongest ally, was now its greatest enemy. Iran's new leadership, under Ayatollah Khomeini, supported the students, calling the embassy a den of spies. To the Iranian people, this was retribution for decades of American meddling in their affairs. The hostage crisis became a symbol of the New World Order, one where Iran no longer feared standing up to the United States. It marked a breaking point in US-Iran relations, with both countries sliding deeper into animosity. In the United States, the hostage crisis was seen as an act of terrorism, a betrayal by a former ally. President Carter's administration scrambled to resolve the situation, launching a failed rescue operation which only deepened the tension. Back in Iran, the hostage-takers were hailed as heroes, symbols of defiance against the West. For the US, this event would mark the beginning of a long and bitter struggle with Iran. It wouldn't end with the release of the hostages. It would lay the foundation for sanctions, proxy wars, and covert operations. And for Iran, it solidified its role as the leader of the anti-American, anti-Western movement in the Middle East. As the hostage crisis came to an end in 1981, it was clear that the wounds between the US and Iran were deep and lasting. But the question remained, what would this new Islamic Republic do next? And how would Israel, the US's closest ally in the region, become entangled in Iran's growing ambitions? Iran's proxy wars and rising influence in the Middle East. With the Islamic Revolution in full swing, Iran set its sights on spreading its influence across the Middle East, and one of the key strategies it used was through proxy wars, backing groups and militias that would fight on its behalf against its enemies. Iran's goal was clear: to dominate the region and undermine US and Israeli interests at every turn. One of the first and most powerful groups Iran began supporting was Hezbollah, a Shia militant group based in Lebanon. Founded in the early 1980s, Hezbollah became Iran's most loyal proxy, fighting against Israeli forces during the Israeli-Lebanese conflicts. With Iran's financial and military support, Hezbollah grew into a formidable force, engaging in direct combat with Israeli troops and carrying out attacks on Israeli targets. But Hezbollah was just the beginning. Iran's strategy of funding and arming Shia militias extended far beyond Lebanon. In Iraq, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, Iran filled the power vacuum by backing Shia paramilitary groups. These militias would grow in power and influence, shaping Iraq's political future in Iran's favor. In Syria, Iran saw another opportunity. When the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, Iran stepped in to support its longtime ally, Bashar al-Assad. Iranian troops, along with Hezbollah fighters, helped Assad's regime fight off opposition forces, many of whom were backed by Western nations and the US. This conflict became a battleground for Iranian and US interests, further deepening the rift between Iran and the West. Through these proxy wars, Iran extended its reach, gaining influence in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and even Yemen, where Iranian-backed Houthi rebels fought against Saudi-led forces. The US and Israel saw these moves as direct threats, as Iran's reach was growing closer to their borders. But for Iran, this was a chance to stand up against its adversaries and assert itself as the dominant power in the region. With proxy forces in place across the region, Iran's influence stretched across the Middle East, challenging both US presence and Israel's dominance. But why was Israel so central to Iran's ambitions? Why did Iran, a predominantly Shia nation, fixate so strongly on opposing the Jewish state of Israel? To answer this, we must look deeper into Iran's ideological drive and its vision for the future of the Muslim world, a vision that sees Israel as a threat to its very existence. While Iran's hatred for the United States is rooted in a history of political interference and economic exploitation, its enmity toward Israel is far more ideological. For Iran, Israel represents everything it opposes. A Western-backed state occupying land that is sacred to Muslims, sitting in the heart of the Middle East. At the core of this hatred lies the issue of Palestine and the fate of Jerusalem, a city holy to both Muslims and Jews. Iran sees itself as the protector of Palestinian rights and the leader of the resistance against Israeli occupation. In the eyes of Iran's leadership, Israel's existence is a constant reminder of Western imperialism in the Muslim world. When Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power in 1979, one of his first declarations was to call Israel a Zionist regime that had no right to exist. He framed the conflict with Israel as a battle between good and evil, between the oppressed and the oppressor. To Khomeini and his successors, Israel was not just a political enemy, it was a symbol of the Western world's dominance over the Middle East. For Iran, the Palestinian cause became a rallying cry, a means to unify the Muslim world against a common enemy. Iran openly supports groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, providing them with weapons, training, and financial aid to continue their fight against Israel. This support has led to repeated clashes between Israel and these militant groups, with Iran pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But for Israel, Iran's involvement has been nothing short of a direct threat to its survival. Israel views Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon and Hamas's attacks from Gaza as Iran's way of encircling the Jewish state, using proxy forces to weaken and destabilize it. The threat isn't just theoretical. Israeli intelligence has pointed to Iranian missiles and weapons flowing into the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas, escalating the stakes of every conflict. And it's not just the proxy wars. Iran's ballistic missile program has further heightened tensions, as many of these missiles are capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory. Iran's leaders have made it clear that they see Israel as a key target if a larger conflict breaks out in the region. But Iran's strategy isn't just about launching missiles, it's about ideology. For the Iranian regime, the very existence of Israel contradicts its vision of a unified Muslim world, free from Western influence. As long as Israel exists, backed by the US, Iran sees its role as the leader of the resistance. For Iran, Israel is not just an enemy state, it's a symbol of everything Iran's revolution stands against. And as tensions escalate, the question remains, how far is Iran willing to go to achieve its vision of a Middle East without Israel? By the early 2000s, Iran had embarked on a path that would shake the global stage, its pursuit of nuclear technology. But was Iran's nuclear ambition solely about energy, or was it part of a larger plan to challenge US and Israeli dominance in the Middle East? Iran claims its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, to provide energy for its growing population, but the West, and particularly Israel, believe otherwise. For years, intelligence reports and satellite images have suggested that Iran's program is far from peaceful, pointing to the enrichment of uranium to levels consistent with developing nuclear weapons. For Israel, Iran's potential to develop nuclear weapons represents an existential threat. Israeli leaders have made it clear they will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear bomb, no matter the cost. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been vocal in warning the international community about the dangers of a nuclear-armed Iran. The US shares this concern and for decades has imposed crippling sanctions on Iran, aimed at stalling its nuclear ambitions. The US has also conducted joint military exercises with Israel, preparing for the possibility of a military strike against Iranian nuclear facilities if diplomacy fails. But Iran remains defiant. Its leaders argue that as a sovereign nation, they have the right to develop nuclear technology, just as other countries like Israel and the US have done. And despite economic sanctions that have devastated Iran's economy, the nuclear program continues to move forward. In 2015, there seemed to be a glimmer of hope for diplomacy. The Iran nuclear deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA), was signed between Iran and world powers, including the US. The deal limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for lifting some economic sanctions. But in 2018, President Trump pulled the US out of the deal, claiming it was too weak and failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program and regional influence. Sanctions were reimposed, and Iran's economy plunged deeper into crisis. In response, Iran resumed its nuclear activities, further heightening tensions. Today, Iran continues to inch closer to the capability of developing a nuclear weapon, despite the economic hardship its people face. For the Iranian leadership, this nuclear ambition represents more than just military strength. It's about survival and maintaining a balance of power in a region dominated by US and Israeli influence. As the world watches closely, the question remains, will Iran's nuclear ambitions push the region toward another war? Or can diplomacy bring the world back from the brink? As we move into the future, the deep-rooted animosity between Iran, the USA, and Israel shows no sign of fading. The conflicts, proxy wars, and ideological battles that have defined their relationships for decades continue to shape the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. But where does it go from here? For Iran, the USA remains the symbol of Western imperialism, a superpower that has meddled in its affairs, supported its enemies, and imposed crippling sanctions on its economy. And Israel, in the eyes of Iran's leadership, is the outpost of this Western influence, a reminder of the foreign powers Iran seeks to expel from the region. Iran's leadership has continued to expand its military capabilities, particularly its missile program, as a deterrent against any potential threats from the US or Israel. The Revolutionary Guard and its elite Quds force remain at the heart of Iran's strategy, extending the nation's influence through proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, keeping Israel on constant alert. For Israel, the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is its greatest fear. Israeli leaders have repeatedly warned that they will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, and Israel has carried out several covert operations to delay Iran's nuclear program, from cyber attacks to assassinations of key Iranian scientists. The tit-for-tat conflict between Israel and Iran has already spilled over into other nations, with proxy wars fought across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. As each side seeks to expand its influence, the region remains in a delicate balance, one wrong move away from igniting a broader conflict. For the United States, Iran's influence across the Middle East remains a strategic challenge. With military bases scattered across the region, the U.S. continues to keep a close eye on Iran's movements, ensuring that its allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are protected from any potential threats. But as economic sanctions take their toll on Iran, the risk of further escalation grows. The Iranian people themselves are caught in the middle of this international struggle. Sanctions have devastated the economy, leading to protests within the country, both against the regime and against Western powers. For many Iranians, the question remains, how long can this cycle of conflict continue before something gives? As the world watches, one question remains, is there a path toward peace, or is a future clash between Iran, the USA, and Israel inevitable? Diplomacy has offered hope in the past, but with tensions at an all-time high, the future remains uncertain. For now, the world holds its breath, waiting to see if these old wounds will ever heal, or if the battle lines will only grow deeper in the years to come.